This is a study we did. The study was funded by the West Midlands Combined Authority and as such forms part of the regional evidence base that goes through to our various economic development boards, of which we are part of, and trying to understand the region better going forward. So in essence, there is a Brexit context to this clearly, but the purpose of this was to do a supply chain mapping exercise of the sector. And the reason that we wanted to do this was because, as Tom said earlier in our previous work with OpenText, what was glaringly apparent from vehicle manufacturers was a distinct lack of understanding of the supply chain. That is, the supply chain tends to be regarded not as, well, a chain as such, but only in terms of the direct contractual relationship with who you're buying and selling to. Because that's, as we've seen in a different sector with textiles and the tragic fires in Bangladesh, where companies like Primark said we didn't know, that will not wash if you are trying to trade into a single market from outside it. Now, I'm not a customs expert, and customs experts will say that it depends on, do you control the chain? Well, that's an interesting term, isn't it? If you're going for a trusted trader status, EORI, authorised economic operator, I think you should take it as given that you will have responsibility for that compliance. And that was the backdrop. I think that was why Tom's point about get digital is so important. And that's not a sales pitch for OpenText. It's simply about understanding your environment, it's about understanding your data. You know, data is key currency in that regard. Who are you dealing with? How much? How long does it take? These are the issues that were really important to us. And they're really important to us because when you look around here, you look around this region, one thing is so readily apparent that it's so basic as to not even be considered. We are a landlocked region. We don't have a border with the sea. You know, it's the only region in the UK that doesn't have a sea border. You know, closest it gets is sort of down towards Gloucester way. And Gloucester ceased to be a working port decades ago because of, you know, ships are bigger now, aren't they? So that was important to us. And so a supply chain mapping exercise then had to have, as a key element of it, where do these things actually get moved around? Where are they coming into the country? Where are they going out? How do they get there? These issues are not unimportant because if we take our regional road network and rail network as an example, if you've ever driven down the A14 during rush hour or the A34 down to Southampton, you will know what I'm talking about. And the context of this is that even if a small proportion of freight traffic were to be rerouted away from Dover, and by Dover I don't particularly mean the port, I mean the Eurotunnel, then what would the knock-on effects be to other ports, the regional road and rail network? A 5% increase in truck traffic during rush hour. So these issues of connectivity are important, so this is why we wanted to do this. So what do? We surveyed large and small suppliers and logistics firms in the Midlands. We wanted to look at the business and client mix. We wanted to look at automotive versus non-auto. 3 sectors we looked at essentially. We looked at automotive, aerospace manufacture, and rail. Now by order of there, auto is clearly the biggest sector, then aerospace, and then rail. We got approximately 150 manufacturers and about 100 freight/logistics firms. The logistics firms primarily cater to the transport manufacturing sector. And we think that's captured about 2/3 of the sector in the region. So we're fairly confident in terms of the representativeness of it in that regard. So we tried to get an understanding of the importance of vehicle manufacturer clients to suppliers, so who were the lead companies? in terms of automotive, you can cut to the chase and say it's pretty obvious who the lead vehicle manufacturer is going to be in terms of importance. You know, by quite an order of magnitude. You know, it's Jaguar Land Rover. Now, I'll come on to that in a minute. That order of magnitude of JLR is extremely important. It's certainly important in terms of employment. I mean, JLR employs directly about 25,000, say, maybe across 5 sites. In terms of the West Midlands, total employment in so-called automotive manufacturers is about 50,000. And then if you take related sectors such as metal fabricators, i.e. parts and components, at least another 20,000. So when we say thousands of jobs are at risk in the event of a hard Brexit, as Ian pointed out, that is absolutely true. Now, of course, how many of those depends on the trajectory of negotiations and so on.
Could you explain what Tier 1, Tier 2?
A supply chain has a vehicle manufacturer, if you take auto.
Yeah.
Tier 1 is the people who directly supply the vehicle manufacturer. Tier 2 then is the people who supply the Tier 1s. Tier 3, Tier 2. Crudely speaking, that's you know, just where are they? And just think of it as a network or a web, yeah, with layers going out. The upshot of that is that the further up the supply chain you go, your Tier 2, your Tier 3, the smaller the businesses tend to be because they become, as a rule, more niche, more parts and components. But what you see here is we've got a nice spread of business sizes and across the 3 sectors. But I think what you want to take from there is that quite a number of companies, particularly parts and components makers, might just be fabricating steel bits, supply more than one of these transport mode manufacturers. I don't want to get too bogged down in the definition of an OEM. OEM here is based upon respondent self-identification, so that might include people who make machine tools, for example, because they're making a finished product, so it's original equipment. As Ian points out to me, it's not the vehicle, but for the purposes of the classification system. So no, we don't have 24 vehicle manufacturers in the Midlands, we know that. But that's the quirks of the survey. The average turnover just under 500 million. Obviously that's going to be distorted by Jaguar Land Rover with a turnover of 25 billion, yes. 22 firms reported turnover greater than 1 million estimated per employee. Median turnover at 32.5 million. So when we did some rough calculations, we came up with a total turnover figure for the sector that closely matched the Office for National Statistics figure. So again, that gives us some confidence. I want to say again though, just before we launch into the specifics, you take automotive, the West Midlands accounts, I think, in terms of employment for about 30% of the sector. But in terms of value added, in terms of work that is done, in terms of R&D, development, it's a lot higher. In the report we have a heat map, if you like. If you look at employment, you see Birmingham, then you see Sunderland, of course, with Nissan, that's the second biggest. But if you look at value added, the West Midlands stands out by a good country mile. The other regions don't get near it. And I think that highlights the somewhat unique position of JLR in the UK auto landscape. The other companies more focused largely on final assembly, I would say. Ian, you're not disagreeing, is that good? Yeah.
But I also think it's also got quite a lot of motorsport related activity.
Yeah. Yeah. I suppose what I'm trying to get at here is that you take JLR for this region, its importance is uncontested, but it is a national strategic asset. And we have to start thinking in those terms. You know, Renault and the French government have a far more strategic relationship than anything we have in this country. And in the event of a Brexit scenario going forward, if we wish to preserve a national strategic asset with all the attendant good engineering jobs, the R&D, the value added that's done, that's going to have to influence our thinking going forward in terms of policy measures. So bear that in mind, please. Now, this surprised me. We talk about, across companies, maybe 10-15% of EU workers in the big picture, automotive sector in particular. In terms of our sample, on average, 31% of the total manufacturing workforce accounted for in our survey were EU workers from other EU countries. You think principally Polish, for example. Some of these respondents were reporting EU worker figures in the order of 80% plus. Obviously that's more of an outlier, but on average you see this. So when you think about that dependency, bear in mind the context here. It's not just the Brexit context of how attractive the UK is as a place to come and live in. It's the other Europe context of phenomenal growth in Eastern European economies in the last 5 years. Poland is the success story of Europe economically in the last 5 years. Its economy has grown by about 50% in real terms. That's the context. So for a European worker coming into the UK with the prospect that if the pound depreciates, the take-home pay is less, it's not just that, it's the pull factor of growing economies elsewhere to bear in mind. That's very important because it feeds into what do we do in terms of skills gaps. I had a very interesting conversation on our questioners before around the capacity of this place to do design and development, and there's an acute skills gap there. So again, I point out places like this are important going forward in terms of harnessing skills and trying to find out what we need to do to develop that skills base in the event of a sudden drop here. Obviously for the smaller firms lesser, but what we were told by respondents typically was that in the case of one firm that lost a volume of European workers over the summer, they simply went and poached them from their suppliers because they can pay better. Not a very strategic response going forward, is it? So we need to consider that. As you might see there, JLR pops up as number one, but of course, we're also somewhat dependent on Nissan. Also Honda. Honda's a known quantity. Honda will disappear by 2021. Mini, Vauxhall, Bentley, etc. Roughly a quarter of this dependence was on companies elsewhere in Europe that we were exporting things to. So as we've already been pointed out, in the event of a hard Brexit, that business particularly looks vulnerable. So if we talk about a measure of exposure for individual suppliers, the standard accepted measure is if you're relying on a firm for more than 20% of your revenue, then you're exposed to the activities of that firm, that vehicle manufacturer, say. And clearly, JLR pops out there. Of course, you get exposed to more than one firm, can't you, by that measure? So yes, there's a lot of importing and exporting going on to and from the EU. 92% of our larger manufacturers, 85% of medium ones, and 60% of smaller ones. Now what's the key point to take away from that slide? The key point to take away from that slide is about 20% of our sample exclusively use the Channel Tunnel. No other mode of transport between here and mainland Europe replicates the rapidity and quickness of the Channel Tunnel. That's a journey time of about 40 minutes. 40 on a good day. Nothing. So, whilst we can control in some fashion the way in which we bring things into the country, the government, for example, saying it would effectively set import duties at zero for particular products in order to help that. We can't control what happens in Calais. We can't control what kind of customs and inspection regime the French government, for example, will put in place. And because of the roll-on, roll-off nature of logistics, drop off something, going out, and then you refill the truck and bring something back in. Hold-ups in Calais on things coming into the UK can have knock-on effects on things going out and so on. It's that interdependency that means that even though we can try and alleviate the pace at which we bring things in, delays in things going into Europe can have knock-on effects on things coming back in. And that's important in the context of the just-in-time supply chain. Dates. Rail, very important, echoing the Channel Tunnel, of course. C, air, less important, particularly for small firms. Much has been said of some manufacturers in the event of a hard Brexit to consider bringing in parts and components, for example, by air. Now, we think that would only really apply to boutique manufacturers like Aston Martin or McLaren, and as Ian is shaking his head there to make abundantly clear, we only think that would be feasible in the short term. That would not be a long-term solution.
How do they add up to more than 100%?
They can, combination responses, they typically can use more than one mode. So, this might surprise you. Dover doesn't pop up with the frequency you might expect it to. It's a bit more diffuse than that. Yes, you're going to ask which is export and which is import, aren't you? Well, the orange is import. Dover is more prevalent as an import than an export.
Sorry, does Dover include the Channel Tunnel?
That is port, seaport. If you ask about the Channel Tunnel, then you get this. In terms of relative intensity of use. Rail link is Channel Tunnel, the column on the right. So what comes out of this? Liverpool you might expect to be important when you consider traffic to and from Ireland. Just think about it, a lot of the Republic of Ireland's exports, imports come via the so-called land bridge, which is the UK.
And Holyhead, I would think.
Yes, yeah, Holyhead as well, yeah. What we find here, though, is ports like Felixstowe and Southampton are of some importance, and it reiterates my earlier point. Just a relatively small increase in use of those ports in the event of a hard Brexit, and it doesn't have to be by the transport manufacturing sector. It could be supermarkets, it could be apparel, pharmaceuticals, whatever, because they will all affect each other. They're all using the same transport network. Now, I'm not a logistics model. I couldn't tell you what a 5% increase in truck traffic will do, but I can tell you qualitatively it will have an impact. And it comes back to our point about the nature of cross-country connections in this country, which actually, in spite of the hub and spoke model we have here, where everything seems to have to connect into London, or around the M25 therefore to Dover, these cross-country links are actually more important than we realise. And if you couple that to transport funding per capita for the English regions as being, compared to London, only about 1/4 to 1/5, might make a case here for some serious rebalancing. Would you agree? Yeah. Yeah. Road and rail links. So yes. In the short term anyway, only freight shipped by air might be unaffected by Brexit. So yeah, it's that dependence on the Channel Tunnel, the combination of speed and cost that really comes out of us. So, when I say no realistic alternative, I mean nothing that would replicate the same quickness and convenience. You stick something on a boat at Rotterdam and ship it to Felixstowe, you're talking what, a 3 or 4 hour journey time, maybe? So yeah, the A14, A34, M3 into Southampton, likely to prove pinch points if we see customs holdups. So Felixstowe, Southampton, Liverpool, all used by law firms in the Port of Dover. So if the relevant block is at Calais, then is it probable then that a major French port with more capacity, Dunkirk, Le Havre? They didn't use over Brest, but that's a long way to the west. Yeah. Increases in journey time all round, basically. So, some slight positives here. Majority of firms stockpile and proactively inform their employees, European employees, about the settled status scheme. But on the other hand, in terms of their sample, only 24% completed detailed, accurate activities around commodity, third and product classification. That was, where is Stuart? Can't see him. The question this morning around tariffs for different, different sectors. Yeah, I mean, the WTO published a whole list of tariff bans, hundreds of them.
Thousands probably.
Yeah, thank you. So, quite complicated for a small business particularly to get their heads around. So yes, that's not surprising, only a quarter of them have actually done this. Only 16% felt their organisation was prepared with necessary skills to complete new customs requirements related to importing and exporting. And the majority felt that overall, in terms of Brexit exposure, 70% of them were at medium risk. The remainder highly exposed on this front. So, let's cut to the chase. What is there to be done? I think it was Lenin who once said that, didn't he? Of course, you were getting answer. What is there to be done? Well, plenty. My own personal philosophy is I have no intention of being a victim. No, I don't see why we should be as a region or a sector either. Now, of course, much of this is beyond our control. It doesn't stop us from trying to argue the case. So we ask people here, well, what kind of measures could government put in place to help you in this regard, adjust to the new landscape? Now we just ask the question about government, because you have distinguished between the combined authority or the Birmingham City Council or Westminster. How many people would necessarily know what they do in terms of who does what? So, what could be done? Well, in terms of the evidence we've just presented, certainly further investment in regional and national transport infrastructure is needed. I don't want to comment too much on HS2 as such, but I think that the hoo-ha around HS2 obscures, I think, an equally important debate around cross-country connectivity. Right? Yeah. Personally, I'm not usually bothered if I get to London in 38 minutes or an hour and 20 minutes, but I do think it's important that when my truck goes to Felixstowe, it doesn't sit there for a day. Direct business funding to cover the cost of Brexit. Further information regarding procedures related to importing and exporting, Gerald. People get easily confused, as you know, so I can always milk them more advice. Tackling skills gaps is imperative, I think. That is imperative. And that's not just a Brexit thing. In my mind, that represents 30 years of strategic failure as a country. Ever since the privatisations of the mid-80s, funnily enough, those state-owned enterprises actually had a useful service because they churned out apprentices by the thousands, more than they needed. They were fulfilling a public service, but we don't, our attitude to training now is just to buy it in from wherever. And that's got to change. That's got to change as a company mindset, and it's got to change as a government mindset. And I think we largely agree that this is something that could be devolved down to regional level skills. And yes, of course, can I leave it to the end unless it's for clarification?
I remember it, yeah.
All right. Yes, business tax regime could be adjusted as well. That's the sort of thing that people want to see. Business rates, of course, always pop up. What cash-strapped local authorities would say that day. So, I'm only going to touch on these lightly because we can talk more around them as a panel. What sort of things can we consider? Most of these measures, of course, would be suggested to national government. I do actually remain Well, I'm actually of a disposition to think that the current government, whatever one's views of it, is probably going to be a bit more left field when it comes to ideas it may consider for policy interventions. I actually think it will. And I think to a large degree that may be foisted upon it because it will have little choice. And so I'm a bit more hopeful that some of the measures that we suggest might actually be taken seriously. You know, as a government insider said to me the other day, well, borrowing isn't an issue because money is cheap at the moment. Important point. Because we might need it. So, a wider regional growth fund, vehicle scrappage schemes, as Dave will tell you, very good in 2008-09. Why not do it again? Short-time working support, you know. Subsidise companies to train their workers 1 or 2 days a week. The Germans did it very well, looking at doing it again. If we end up paying tariffs on exports to the EU, refund them. You know, the EU pension scheme where, you know, the South Africans do this.
It's complicated.
But it can be done. Writing off government loans, preferential loans, hell, even taking equity stakes in manufacturers. If we can do it with the banks, why can't we do it with manufacturers? Bailouts to prevent financial collapse. Think of GM and Chrysler in the US back in 2008. Training, funding, supply chain diversification, infrastructure for electric vehicles, etc. Oh. And yes, sorry, I just skipped through that slide, but consider the establishment of a special economic zone. You know, the Prime Minister, of course, is keen on the idea of free ports and special economic zones. Other countries in the EU have them. Luxembourg, anyone? Ireland? Yeah, we can do that. Now, of course, a few minutes later. Wow. Look, the special economic zone, I think, has some particular attraction because it appears costless in a sense, doesn't it? It doesn't so much require government to spend on something as for government to say, well, you operate in this zone, you'll be exempt from various taxes and the like. That's an interesting one, isn't it?
Well, obviously that's not costless, you know. If you're going to increase government
yes, I mean,
expenditure
then
and then cut the taxes,
well, you're just going to have to borrow more, aren't you? As I said, money is cheap at the moment, and UK debt to GDP ratios are not historically high at this point in time. Japan managed to get through much of the post-war period with debt to GDP ratios of around 120%. We're operating at what, 70%?
80%,
Yeah, it's much lower. So we have significant room to increase spending, is my point. That's my point, you know. It all depends on the political will. So yes, worth serious consideration. Okay.
Can I just make one point?
Yeah.
One of my bugbears that I did have during the election, the lead up to the election, I think the government was saying that once we're outside the EU, we can establish free ports. Those free ports are illegal in the EU. I think the incorrect, even on the EU's website, there is a list of something like 40 or 50 free zones which exist within the EU, and the UK is one of the very few countries which doesn't have them. We used to have them up until about 2004, I think, something like that, when they were known as special economic zones. This is a matter of naming them, and the Treasury basically didn't like them because it was foregoing taxes, but they exist all over Europe. And in fact, the Toyota engine factory in Poland operates within the special economic zone or free port.
Yeah.
Quite legally.
The only question mark over them might well be, you know, what EU attitudes to state over the negotiations coming forward.
But there is a principle that they operate already, so if you do it under their rules.
Yeah, then why can't we? Yeah. Okay.
Thanks, Alex. Really interesting findings. What I'd like to bring in now is Rachel Eade, who's at University of Birmingham. Warwick Manufacturing Group? No, just University of Birmingham. Rachel works very much on the railway side of things at Birmingham, but in a previous life worked in the manufacturing advisory service and made a number of absolutely critical interventions which saved big chunks of the supply chain in West Midlands, both around Aerospace, around the global financial crisis, around the earthquake and tsunami in Japan. She knows more about supply chain in the region than anyone. So, Rachel.
Thanks, gents. I've got absolutely no preparation. do you want to say, David? I think I'm going to pick up, I think, on what I think some of the potential discussion areas are going to be around recommendations and the responses that we're looking to move forward. Partly because I think there is some call to actions, but also for some further work in terms of research and strategy development. So, the region, the West Midlands, is a trailblazer for local industrial strategy. So the government launched its industrial strategy middle of last year. The West Midlands did a very glossy, nice brochure launch that said nothing. Just we're going to have a local version of industrial strategy. But behind the scenes, there has been a lot of work on the sector, individual plans for that local industrial strategy. There is now a little bit of a push to try and get something together to be published in the spring. My gut feeling is that will be post-budget. But there is quite a lot of work going on. So there will be, I'm going to say consultation, it may be mini consultation, but anybody that is interested in infrastructure, skills, property, place, people, the local enterprise partnerships are doing the consultation, leading on the consultation, and those are the opportunities to get your questions in, but to be beginning to shape the activity that we're looking for that will begin to address connectivity and infrastructure. Because if we drill down to what we're talking about here, it's about connectivity and infrastructure, and where the investment and how we can make that work together. And it's not just the automotive or the rail or the manufacturing supply chain. I know there's people here that come from London and other places on the train this morning. Some guys are rushing on to go to London. It's actually how we get around the country and transport ourselves. Obviously there's some big announcements pending, particularly in rail, but similarly in automotive, so those big decisions are still pending. And I think we have to recognise that there is support there. So when you mentioned RGF, I don't think there will be another RGF. I don't think regional rail. But there will be. But we are waiting. And again, if people are interested in what is currently known as the UK Prosperity Fund, that will be launched in January 2021. But that is currently going through its consultation, its shaping stages. There is a call that it will at least replicate the level of European funds that we have now. But how that is shaped, how it gets devolved for local use, and what are the priorities for those funds, again, is in the shaping now. So that, again, I think some research and how we can help lobby for that. But promotion of the current support that is available there for supply chain companies, whatever their size, there is still, I don't know what to put it, shed loads of European money that we can use for in particular SME support, be that in skills, in people. There is capital to help people buy upgraded machinery, technology, and particularly in innovation and research. That covers all sectors, most parts of the country, but in the West Midlands it will cover every company that we can think of. There is money there for all those projects. You can have more than one application, you can access multiple funds. Yes, there's some bureaucracy and some paperwork, but most funds are desperate to maximise their spend. Because you know what? Otherwise it just goes back to Europe. So we want to and need to spend that money, and that will engage and start the process of support and help. And there has been, in October, the government funded quite a lot of Brexit preparation workshops. So I ran across the country some rail workshops, and I think the findings were very similar to this in terms of, actually I think the people that attended, their level of preparation, I think it was 0.5% of the people that had done any real preparation. So there was a lot of money spent. That money has now been transferred into and is sitting, and so every growth hub in the West Midlands has at least one, if not more, dedicated Brexit advisor. So as an SME, if you're sitting, where do I go for help? I would recommend get hold of that person, if nothing else, have a telephone conversation and talk to them, because again, that will open up the access to the diagnostic, the review, to help you prioritise what it is you need to do. So I think there's a lot of help there, but we still need to continue in terms of shaping the research that will influence the strategy going forward.
Couldn't agree more. Can I make a quick point there? Rachel, you reminded me about capacity, particularly for smaller businesses. You know, when you're an owner-operator, you don't have time. That's what they would tell you, to raise your head above the parapet and go to a 3-day Brexit workshop. And it makes me think, we look at the institutional capacity we have in this country, and it's weak. And it's weak because it represents a legacy of volunteerism. And a classic example is membership at your Chamber of Commerce. You go to other countries in Europe, I think Germany may be an example, it's compulsory. It's compulsory. So the ability to harness business intelligence both ways would be significantly enhanced if we did the same in this country. The chambers, of course, would thank me because their coffers would increase, but you see my point. Okay.
And a really good example on that, so Birmingham Chamber are running on Friday morning a West Midlands Birmingham transport session, very focused on the clean air zone. It's been oversold, so they're having to run a second one on Monday. But that is through chamber membership. It's free, so if you're not a member, you can attend, but you do need to book onto it. But because they are so engaged with the local authority, that's where the information source is primarily held.
Okay, thank you.